I went to a gathering with some friends, and we were all sitting around the campfire, and there was a girl on her phone. And at the time, I had no idea who she was, but I was like, oh, she's on her phone. I'm going to go up and talk to her and, include her in the conversation. And so I go up and I say, what are you doing? And her name was Callie Lucina, and she was flying the Exalta 1 satellite from her phone. And she wasn't on the phone because she felt excluded. She was flying the satellite. She had to get the pass. And so that was kind of the thing that sparked it. And we had this great conversation, and we ended up getting coffee the next day to hear more about the industry. And I remember leaving that coffee conversation saying, this is the industry I want to work in. It felt so inspiring and my heart was racing. And then the light bulb went off, as cliche as it sounds, but that's really how I entered the space industry and how my passions really got sparked.
Hello and welcome to Say Hi to the Future, a podcast aimed at highlighting the human side of ingenuity. My name is Ken Tenser, CEO of SpyderWorks. With me today is Abigail Hoover, industrial design graduate student and deputy project manager for AlbertaSat, an undergraduate group at the University of Alberta, which designs, builds, and launches satellites into low Earth orbit. Like this video if you enjoy our show and subscribe to our channel. Leave us a comment with who we should interview next. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy the show. Abigail Hoover, welcome to Say Hi to the Future.
Hi, Ken. Thank you for having me on. It's nice to meet you.
Oh, this is so cool. I got to say to our guests and to you, I have never said this in a sentence before. You are a student and you help to design, build, and launch satellites into orbit. Those are two things that I know I've never combined a sentence. So let's start at the beginning, Abigail. Tell us about you and your journey into industrial design.
Thanks. Yeah, it's an interesting story. I feel like that typically catches people off guard when you say that you used to be an operator for a CubeSat. But yes, like you mentioned, I am an industrial design student. I just graduated from the University of Alberta's industrial design program. And alongside that, I've been kind of working with the AlbertaSat student group here at the U of A, which, like you mentioned, aims to design, build, and launch CubeSats into low Earth orbit. And so alongside all of that, it kind of speaks to a larger ambition for myself to one day work in the aerospace industry through a design lens. And we'll be continuing on to a master's to do exactly that. And it's been a really great journey so far to kind of combine both industries and learn from both sides. And it's been very unique and very rewarding.
Cool. So what is industrial design like? What did you study? What did you learn?
That's a really good question. I feel like it is not necessarily a well-known industry, especially where I'm from in Edmonton, but the program that I was in is quite small, actually. There's only about 30 or 40 students, and it revolves around human-centered design and really looking at how we as designers can improve quality of life for users. And many people, I think, when they think of design, they typically go towards, furniture design or interior design, car design. And although those are very key components of the program, it expands well beyond that, looking at products and services, systems, experiences and emotions of the user, and kind of looking at broader issues and saying, okay, what are the key problems here? And how can we create tangible impact and long-lasting solutions that work for the individuals we're designing for without hurting their communities, environments. That's kind of what we focus on. It's very collaborative, it's very project-based, and you get a lot of perspectives in the room, which is really great.
So it sounds like you learn how to be a great problem solver.
That's a key part of the program. And yes, we do. In fact, actually, when we do our projects, we do our design assignments. Although we do get judged on the back end of the design, what we actually come up with, the primary weighting of it all kind of focuses on the front end, making sure the profs, what they're really looking for is, okay, have you really figured out who you're designing for and what the issue at hand actually is? And with that, kind of what are the wants, needs, and limitations of those individuals? What are the constraints you're working with? Feasibility, all of those things get considered. And that's really what we get graded on. And as we enter the industry, what we really focus on as human-centered designers.
And so can you give us some examples, even from, some of your student work or research? Like, what are some of those breakthroughs that to sort of help you design, if you will, the right product or service? Like, what do you hear back that makes you go, oh, that is a key insight, and what do I do with it?
Right. Oh, key examples. I'll have to think about that one. But I think the biggest thing that we definitely learn, and probably something that I had no idea I would learn going into this industry, was this idea of catching yourself on unconscious biases. And we really prioritize user research. And it's kind of said multiple times throughout the design community that as designers, in many ways, you can lead the design process, but it should be your users leading the design. And so typically you'll enter a project thinking, okay, you know what, person X is probably going to feel this way. And you talk to them and you work with them for multiple weeks and you leave saying, you know what, I couldn't have been more wrong. This is not what they need. This is not what they desire. We have to pivot our approach to this project. And I think that's kind of the critical thing that I've taken away from the program, is saying, okay, you know what, at the end of the day, I really need to understand who I'm designing for and speak to these people and work with these people. And that's how you create an impactful project at the end.
Well, that's great insight, especially you said, the users, you need to be designing for the users for what they want. There's so many companies still that I meet that are focused on what it is that they want to do, what they want to put out. And I always sort of laugh and say, well, you're not writing the checks. You're hoping people write checks to you. So I love what you're saying.
Thank you. Yeah.
So you're heading off to England, if I'm correct. What are you doing there?
I am, yes. I'll be moving to England, London in August. I'll be starting my master's at the Royal College of Art in conjunction with Imperial College London. The program's called Global Innovation Design, and I will be forwarding my research ambitions of utilizing space-based technology to forward sustainable social and environmental life on Earth through human-centered design. But the great thing about the program is that, and from what I've seen coming out of the program, is everybody goes in with a completely different research topic that they've been developing for a considerable amount of time. And then you're put in this co-design environment where people can critique each other, input new ideas from different industries, and really develop these great paths forward to tackling large scale issues like the Sustainable Development Goals or other issues of that scale.
So let's unpack that, because that's quite an incredible statement or statement of topic, if you will. So first, where did you find this passion or love for space? Like, where does that start?
When I first entered university, I did so in engineering, and I really excelled in high school in math and science. And I think also being a female excelling in those subjects, you really are encouraged to go into engineering and science and continue that path forward. And so I went into it not really interested in space. And I had no idea about design. It wasn't even on my radar until about a year into my university career, where things weren't really lining up. My interests weren't really aligning up with my passions and what I was studying. And that's a story for another day, how I actually entered the design program. But I remember back when I first started university, I heard about AlbertaSat, the group that I'm working with now. And I didn't even consider joining it at the time because I was busy with studies. And then about a year in, I had switched into design. I was very excited. And I went to a gathering with some friends, and we were all sitting around the campfire, and there was a girl on her phone. And at the time, I had no idea who she was, but I was like, oh, she's on her phone. I'm going to go up and talk to her and, include her in the conversation. And so I go up and I say, what are you doing? And her name was Callie Lucina, and she was flying the Exalta 1 satellite from her phone. And she wasn't on the phone because she felt excluded. She was flying the satellite. She had to get the pass. And so that was kind of the thing that sparked it. And we had this great conversation, and we ended up getting coffee the next day to hear more about the industry. And I remember leaving that coffee conversation saying, this is the industry I want to work in. It felt so inspiring and my heart was racing. And then the light bulb went off, as cliche as it sounds, but that's really how I entered the space industry and how my passions really got sparked.
So I got to say that's two things you've said or put together that I've never heard before. Obviously, the second is I was at a party and somebody was flying a satellite from their phone.
Yeah, exactly. And Callie's gone on to become one of my biggest mentors and friends, and we joke about that all the time on just what are the odds that happens, and I just happen to be in the right place at the right time.
Well, I think that's awesome, to be perfectly honest. So tell us about, is there a link between the industrial design program you were doing in Alberta SAT, or was that purely because of that coincidental meeting?
There definitely wasn't a link at the beginning, and I think that's been something, one of the biggest challenges that I've had to face, trying to develop my ambitions to work in aerospace through design, but it's also been one of the most rewarding ones. And I remember beginning to work on Alberta SAT primarily in engineering roles. And to be honest, the first few years of my work in aerospace had been through engineering-based kind of research or work terms. And it wasn't until I really started to find my voice as a designer where I realized, you know what, there's a bit of a disconnect here, and there's not a clear path forward that I can follow. So I need to make my own, essentially. And it's been a lot of taking on every single opportunity that gets presented and being willing to learn, I think, is a critical part, but also developing and finding those sponsors and supporters that can teach you and kind of show you the ways in which you can connect two industries together. And that in turn creates opportunity in the long run. But it really was a bit of a roadblock at the beginning because I was coming in with these design ideas and learning how to be a designer and a human-centered designer and going into an industry that is relatively absent of human presence. And so that was, it was a bit of an interesting journey.
You know what, tell us about the satellites, and but before we go into what they're used for, but tell us about this. I mean, why are they being launched? What are they looking for? What were you helping with?
Absolutely, yes. So the Alberta SAT student group, we're a group of about 80 to 100 students. We're undergraduate based from the University of Alberta, and we were created in 2010. And so it includes students from engineering, science, but also business, arts, education. It's very transdisciplinary. And our main objective is, yes, to design and build, test, launch, and operate satellites into low Earth orbit. And currently, right now, we are building a satellite constellation in partnership with two other institutions called Northern Spirit Constellation. And our primary one is Exalta 2. And this will be the second satellite that Alberta SAT has built. And alongside this mission, the mission objective, I suppose, is to monitor, analyze, and prevent Canadian forest fires. And so we have a student-built imager called Iris. It will be on the satellite, it will photograph, and all of these images, all of our data will be shared open source, so anybody in the world can view our research. And how the project first arose is actually there was the Fort McMurray fires burning in Alberta, and that was a massive natural disaster, and many of us living right by Fort McMurray were affected or had friends that were affected. And so this was right when we were picking what the payload or science experiment would study, and it was a no-brainer that we wanted to move in that direction.
Firstly, when you launch, what is lower Earth orbit, and how does that distinguish from other Earth orbits, I would say?
That's a really good question. So we will be, because we're launching a CubeSat, is what our satellite structures are called. They're about the size of a loaf of bread, which not many people, I think of when they think satellites. They think the International Space Station are these massive machines. But yes, so we'll be CubeSats, and we get deployed, or we get loaded onto a NASA or SpaceX resupply mission for the International Space Station. And so we're sent up with all the food for the astronauts, other space missions. Our satellites are on there, and then they get put on the ISS, and then astronaut literally loads them into a deployer and kind of just shoots them out into space. And we're considered low Earth orbit because that's the altitude the ISS is at. We're about 400 to 450 kilometers above the ground. And because of that, our satellites slowly just get pulled into the Earth in about 2 years and we end up burning up. So they're short, inexpensive missions, you could say.
Okay. And you mentioned something about being part of a constellation. What does that, or how does that work?
Although we're building Exalta 2, which will be completely built in-house by the AlbertaSat team, we partnered with 2 other institutions, Yukon University and the Aurora Research Institution in Inuvik. And this came to be from a larger program where we initially got our main funding from, which was the Canadian Space Agency's Canadian CubeSat project. And so what's going to happen is, and what's happening currently right now in our labs is AlbertaSat's building the buses of all 3 satellites, or the structure, if you will, and Yukon University and ARI, they're supplying their own science missions or payloads. And so they will be integrated onto our satellites, and they're studying really amazing stuff. Their payloads are educational outreach based. They're going to have both an imager and a screen that will display northern-made student art to photograph it with earth and sky in the background. They will be broadcasting northern stories about the earth and sky across the world over amateur radio bands and a few other things. But that one's really cool because I think it speaks to a social sustainability initiative that you don't necessarily see in the aerospace world.
That's incredible. I think that's the word I'm using most speaking to you today. One of the things you talk about, and I think you broached it now, is that your focus on forwarding life on Earth.
Right.
How does, and you've given some examples, obviously, with forest fires and broadcasts. What does that mean to you, forwarding life on Earth, and how does this tie into what you're doing?
I think that's something, as I grow as a young professional and as a designer as well, and as a person, it's an ongoing fluid understanding about this. But when I first kind of started working with aerospace and bringing in human-centered design, we revolve around improving quality of life for people. And so it just was a natural thought for me to say, okay, how can we take this amazing vantage point that is space and reflect on, you could quote Carl Sagan's "Our pale blue dot, the only home we've ever known," and really utilize this amazing, unique, competitive industry that really stops and gets people's attention to change the discussion of sustainability on Earth. And there's many ways that they could do that. You could look at, for example, space spinoffs, where you take space technology and apply it to real Earth applications, like the NASA water filtration system is a really great example of that. Or you can look at it in another way of kind of this idea of international transdisciplinary collaboration that kind of gets people to stop and take a look and, perhaps look at this habitat and change their sustainable habits as a result of that.
Got it. That's great. You mentioned too transdisciplinary collaboration. What is transdisciplinary collaboration?
Well, I guess at its core, it's bringing in different expertise and getting multiple different perspectives in the room. And as designers, we become very accustomed to kind of molding to different industries, but not necessarily are other industries molded to accommodate all of these different perspectives and biases. And space, in many ways, like mentioned, it's highly competitive, it's expensive, it's very technical. And so you do need the engineers and the scientists to produce products or services. But what happens when you start bringing in the business individuals or the artists or the designers and looking at this pre-established system and saying, okay, you guys have developed an amazing platform. How can we utilize this platform to forward topics such as education or, environmental sustainable awareness? Communication obviously is a huge one that space brings. And I think that's the opportunity with space is to, I might have mentioned it, but this concept of missions, not majors, where look at the large scale objective here and how can we utilize different disciplines and different perspectives to make it a reality.
So you bring all these people to the room with the different backgrounds and perspectives. You really are in an industry or an aspiration to change the future of the world or Earth or how we work. Do people are people good collaborators on that level? And I say that because if in business, frankly, a lot of teams just don't work well together. People are too agenda based, and you had sort of talked about that in the design process, is shedding you and becoming the team and becoming the mission. How do you get people to really work and collaborate and focus when something is this competitive, when something is this expensive?
Right. I think that's one of the biggest challenges. And if I'm being honest, I think that one of the main ways human-centered designers could be of use in aerospace, because I wouldn't say we're a comfy specialty. When you deal with things like human emotions, life, and interactions, which are inherently subjective and very personal, that's when it's essential to get a strong dialect and collaboration amongst people. But that's not necessarily easy. And one of the ways of gauging success, I think, when you're in that room is when you kind of sense maybe a little bit of tension, or if people are a little bit uncomfortable, because that's when you know you're really hitting the core of an issue and you can elaborate on, kind of dig a little deeper on that. And I think when it comes to actually forming those connections initially, it is quite difficult because, like you said, everybody is kind of working towards their own specific objectives. That's why I think aerospace could be very useful in that. It encompasses everything, really. And, I think the reality of it is there's a bit of an outrageousness to space, where you ask these incredibly impossible questions that seem completely impossible at the time, going to the moon, traveling to Mars, building a lunar gateway. And typically people may shut the door on that, but what the industry provides is an opportunity for everyone to kind of stop and say, you know what, listen, maybe this is possible. Maybe if we put in the time and effort to this, we can make it a reality. I think 20 years ago, people would never think a group of university undergrads would be launching satellites, but here we are. And I think that's the way the industry is going, and it'll be really interesting to see how it continues to grow.
Why is it important? I mean, there's so many issues on Earth. Why is it important to be sending satellites up?
Well, I think, space is obviously an essential part to life on Earth right now. Communications, navigation, Earth observation, all of those big things that have contributed so much to our understanding of life on Earth and the health of our planet and the health of our people. And so I think that's really inspiring. And I think the other thing that you could look at in more of a micro scale too is, as this industry grows and it's becoming more available and accessible to a wider audience, for example, we could use AlbertaSat, there becomes an opportunity to really grow and inspire and kind of have a little bit of a trickle down effect. For example, AlbertaSat, we have a massive educational outreach section where I think since January of 2022, we've reached over 900 students in terms of educating them on space science and social and environmental kind of sustainability and what our payloads do, and engaging with these younger audiences. And I think that's what's really important. I think on the other side of it too is, we kind of mentioned it briefly, is space is kind of seen as a big player. It kind of gets people to stop when you're in the room speaking about it. And there's this kind of idea of changing habits and habitats when it comes to sustainability and making people think about it as a different way. I think especially when it comes to changing personal habits within, your home or your life, sometimes that gets a bit washed out, or the necessity of it gets a little bit, forgotten about. And so space could be utilized to kind of get people to stop and rethink what their actions are just because of its influence. And there's a really great quote from a paper that I read recently. It's I Heart Sustainability Because Necessity is No Longer Necessary by Cameron Tonkinwise. And they mentioned they kind of speak to it in a metaphorical sense of having energy conserving lights that switch off in the absence of detected motion in a room does not lead to energy conserving behavior more widely in relation to shower length or car travel distances. And it speaks to this necessity that people need to build sustainable habits. And I thought that was really interesting.
It is. And, as you read that and you tell your story, I mean, we've had some really incredible guests, and everybody says, what's the river that runs through it? And for us, it's passion, savage curiosity, and audacity. And there's no question that you have all three in the way that you're talking about it and expressing what you've already accomplished, which is incredible. What makes you a future thinker? Did you just wake up one day and say, this is how I think or what I want to think? I mean, it's, your thinking, your thought process, your inquisitiveness, it is so well developed. Any insights for the rest of us?
Thank you.
For those who are on Earth all the time.
Yeah, I swear it's a lot of talk, but no, I appreciate that, and it's something I'm trying not to lose sight of and continuously grow on and learn from other people. And I think probably one of the biggest contributors to holding this mindset is to make sure you're surrounding yourself by people that inspire you and can learn and teach you and, bring new opportunities to you. And I think that's something that has always been a key component of my journey. And I've been very lucky to have the opportunity to meet people like that and continuously work and collaborate with them. And I think the other side of it too is throughout my degree and designers in general, but really anybody that's producing a physical product or a service in the end, we are taught to hold this this responsibility of sustainability and looking at, our solutions can no longer just last 5 weeks or 5 months. They need to be lasting longer. They need to be adaptable and transcend and grow with the users and the communities in positive ways. And a huge part of that is to really reflect and say, okay, why are we really creating this? And what does it need to facilitate? And I think that just embodies the definition of a future thinker. You always have to be thinking about the future when you're designing. And yeah, I guess that kind of summarizes it.
It's a great summary. So Abigail, as our time comes to a close today, one question remains for me. Who are your heroes?
Oh, wow. My heroes. When I think about probably who has impacted my life the most, and when I write, the essays about who I am as a designer and everything, I do always come back to probably my family. I would say specifically my dad has always held this mentality of learning above anything else. You're a lifelong learner, and it's not just in academics, it's every single person, every single opportunity, every single disaster, you can learn something from it. And I think that's something that, even in the hardest times, he's always kind of carried that mentality and put a positive spin on it. And I think that's been something that I would say, yes, yeah, he's probably my biggest hero in that regard.
Well, that sounds great. And Abigail Hoover, I really appreciate you joining us today on Say Hi to the Future.
Thank you so much, Ken. It was a pleasure being here.